Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is that Travis Kelce is back this week after the bye, and maybe he had a couple of bad weeks prior to that, but anytime that you get the top tight end back into your lineup, you got to be feeling a whole lot better about your chances that week. But now for the bad news. And the bad news is pretty straightforward. Outside of a couple of other guys and Travis Kelce, the tight end position, well, it still sucks. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Week 11 is really going to bring the same type of issues we've had all season long. If you don't own one of the top guys at the tight end position, well, you're struggling to find somebody that can really help us out right now, especially given the fact that we lost Dallas Goedert before the bye. And outside of maybe like Trey McBride, there's not a whole lot of other guys that have stepped up out of nowhere. But we're going to go through every matchup this weekend to try and figure out who is going to be some of the best options at the tight end position. So if you're struggling, hit the like button for me and subscribe to the channel right now, because I'm going to dive into everything for week 11 and we're going to find the tight end that you need to win the matchup. Our AFC North matchup on Thursday Night Football is going to bring at least one good tight end that we can take a look at. And last week, Mark Andrews, it was only the second time all season that he failed to record at least 60 yards and or a touchdown in a game this season. And going up against the Cincinnati Bengals this week, I expect him to get right back on track. Because right now, Cincinnati is allowing the 6th most fantasy points to the tight end position. And this 100% looks like a matchup where Baltimore is going to have to throw the football, and it could be a little bit of a back and forth matchup. And if all that holds true, Lamar Jackson should be looking at his number one target, Mark Andrews. And while Thursday Night Football doesn't always bring the best offensive matchups in the world, I am banking on Mark Andrews to really go over his current line set on Underdog of 54.5 receiving yards. And you know what? Why don't we go ahead and head on over to the app and just lock that pick'em in right now. Cincinnati is allowing the 5th most receiving yards to tight ends on the season, almost about 65 receiving yards per game. So banking on Mark Andrews to go over his current line and possibly even higher in a game where Lamar Jackson will probably be throwing the football just as much as we've seen all season long, I'm absolutely willing to bank on that this week. And if you're looking to play this pick'em as well, head on over to the Underdog app, download it. When you sign up for a new account and a first time deposit of at least $10, make sure you use code word Headliners, because Underdog is going to match that deposit up to $100, and they're going to give you a special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit. And even though Irv Smith Jr. in this matchup continues to be fantasy irrelevant, Mark Andrews should do more than enough this week against Cincinnati to make up for both of them. Even with 17 targets over the past 2 games, Jake Ferguson has not quite solidified himself as a safe option at the tight end position, as much as I would love for that to happen. Even though Dallas threw it all over the New York Giants last week, the Carolina Panthers do have a better pass defense, ranking 6th in the league right now and allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. And even though Ferguson had 7 targets last week, he was only able to haul in 4 of those for only 26 yards. It was that touchdown that really helped solidify the week. But the good news is that's now 3 straight games with a touchdown from Jake Ferguson. So really in this matchup against Carolina, I expect a lot of the same thing. Dallas will pass it in this one early and often, and I do believe they're going to try to get the ground game going a little bit earlier than what we saw last week. But even with that being said, if Jake Ferguson finds himself with anywhere between 5 and 7 targets, the yards might not really be enough to give him a really solid fantasy ceiling for the week. So we're going to be hoping on a touchdown for him to reach that. And as far as his floor goes, he's really going to have 40 or more receiving yards to put him in the conversation of a top 12 tight end. So let's just keep our fingers crossed that Dallas comes out throwing, Jake Ferguson is at the center of that, and we find that ceiling once again in week 11. Right before I got ready to record this episode, it was announced that Deshaun Watson would end up missing the rest of the year with a fractured shoulder. And say what you will about Deshaun Watson, and I know there's plenty of negative things to say about him, battling through a broken shoulder in that game last week and for them to win is still pretty freaking impressive. But the question is going to be, really what happens in the passing game, and does this help or hurt anyone? And I've actually said this a few times this season. I think David Njoku is actually better off without Deshaun Watson. Now, maybe this year's numbers are too small of a sample size, but this concern dates all the way back to last season, because last year I brought up the point that at the beginning of the year when Deshaun Watson was suspended, David Njoku was one of the #1 targets on this team with Jacoby Brissett. And then towards the end of the year when Deshaun Watson came back, it was like David Njoku really only turned into a red zone option and wasn't receiving nearly as much of attention or volume as he deserved after a breakout campaign. Well, that sprinkled over into this season as well, because the numbers do look a lot different for David Njoku when Deshaun Watson is on the field versus when he's off the field. Because when Deshaun Watson plays, David Njoku averages 4 catches per game on 4.2 targets and only 35 receiving yards. But when Deshaun Watson hasn't played, David Njoku has averaged 4.5 catches per game on 7 targets and over 50 receiving yards per game. Now, Pittsburgh defense may allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, and they aren't nearly the type of shutdown defense that we've come to expect from Pittsburgh in the past. They can get gashed a little bit more than normal this year, but they still have a really good pass rush, and they know how to get after the quarterback. And honestly, with PJ Walker at quarterback again this week in a really tough matchup, I'm going to bet that David Njoku gets back to being a green start for us. Get the ball out quick, get it into the hands of your playmakers, and that guy is going to be David Njoku. So maybe he doesn't have the ton of upside that we would like to see at the tight end position right now. I do think we get back to seeing those targets, which help establish a much safer floor. It was also announced that Pat Freiermuth is currently on track to play against the Browns this week. And I don't know if I'm going to start him right off the bat. I do know that he's been dropped in plenty of leagues. So if you see him on your waivers, I would pick him up and at least stash him if you're dealing with issues at the tight end position. I don't really know if he's going to get a ton of looks this week. Cleveland's defense is still really, really good, and they allow the fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So the targets may not be there for the Muth this week, but the one thing that we could see would be some red zone looks. And if he's able to haul one of those in for a touchdown, would not have a bad week. But regardless of how high the upside could possibly end up being in this matchup, I want to give it another week with the Muth, make sure he's fully healthy, make sure it's a little bit of a better matchup, and then we will start throwing him back into our lineups. My Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week is going to be the Chicago Bears and the Detroit Lions. Cole Kmet versus Sam Laporta, 2 of the best young tight ends in all of football. If you're looking to shop for some stocking stuffers or a really sweet present this year, make sure you head on over to manscaped.com for your holiday shopping. When you see everything that you want, because they've got a ton of new stuff on the website, make sure you check out with code word headliners, and you're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. It does look like Justin Fields is set to make his return this week against the Lions, and the Lions in the last couple of years have struggled with mobile quarterbacks who can get outside the pocket and extend plays. So in this matchup, it would not surprise me to see Cole Kmet receive a hefty amount of targets from his favorite quarterback. Now, Tyson Bagent didn't do that bad of a job of taking care of Cole Kmet and giving him some fantasy upside while Justin Fields was out with his thumb injury. But we know that Fields and Kmet have a better connection than a lot of other quarterbacks and tight ends in the league. And this week, going up against Detroit, where one of their weak spots seems to be defending the tight end position, Cole Kmet could be in for a really nice upside day, even if the floor is a little bit lower, because we really don't know what to expect with Justin Fields coming back just yet. The Chicago Bears allow the 3rd most fantasy points to the tight end position. And Sam Laporta didn't have that bad of a week last week, but man, Brock Wright stealing that touchdown really killed his upside that he had going up against the Chargers. But this week against the Chicago Bears, I expect to see a heavy dose of Sam Laporta once again. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown and it's Sam Laporta. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is getting way more involved in the passing game, and Chicago absolutely sucks at stopping running backs in the the passing game. And because of that, Sam Laporta could see a drop in a couple of targets if Gibbs is used more often. And we also have to wait and see what the score is like. If Detroit is up by a lot at halftime and they're just pounding the football in the second half, it could also bring down Sam Laporta's ceiling. But he's one of the safest tight ends in all of football, especially when he has a really good matchup. Well, just like we called it last week, we saw the Detroit Lions utilize their tight ends against the Los Angeles Chargers, who still allow the 5th most fantasy points to the tight end position and the most passing yards in the league. Now, Sam Laporta didn't have a huge day like we were hoping for, but Brock Wright, one of their other tight ends, did have a big-time touchdown. And if you add the stats together, the tight end position did very well against the Chargers, who continue to struggle stopping it. This week, Luke Musgrave and his big play potential is a guy that I'm targeting to finish inside the top 12. And the same complaint about Musgrave holds true that it has the last few weeks, and it's the fact that he's just not getting nearly as many targets as we would like. He has only been targeted 5 or more times in a game 3 times this season, but the big play potential that we continue to talk about has been on full display. He's averaging over 10 yards per reception on the season right now, but 17 yards per reception 2 weeks ago and 32 yards per reception last week. Maybe it's only one big play per game, or maybe it's a couple here and there, but Luke Musgrave can strike from anywhere on the field. And seeing as how Christian Watson continues to get 7 targets a game, I really hope Green Bay will stop giving him so many targets and start throwing a little bit more to Luke Musgrave. And I'm really hoping it starts to lock in this week. Before Gerald Everett departed last week's game with a back injury, he only had 2 targets. And again, this was in a game where almost 1,000 total yards were combined between the two teams. So even though he missed the entire second half, it's really disappointing that he was not utilized way more in the first half. So even if he's ready to go this week, I am very highly doubtful that he's going to put together the type of game that we would want in our fantasy lineup anyway. For Donald Parham, he's a severe risk every single week. The one thing that we will keep an eye on, though, if for some reason Gerald Everett were to miss this game against Green Bay, Donald Parham is going to carry some touchdown upside. Now, maybe his overall value, when you take a look at the yards that he puts together and the receptions, may be only worth like 2 or 3 fantasy points, but the 6 points for that touchdown could absolutely put him inside the top 12. But once again, only if Everett misses. Trey McBride could be the savior for those of you that picked him up off the waiver wire a couple of weeks ago. Because even with the move from Joshua Dobbs and Clayton Tune back to a healthy Kyler Murray, Trey McBride has continued to see a really good amount of targets since Zach Ertz went down with his injury. And Kyler Murray moving forward will probably continue to target Trey McBride quite often. One point that I want to bring up again real quick, in case you missed it last week, I talked about the fact that at the beginning of Kyler Murray's career, he really did not utilize the tight end position in Arizona. But when Arizona brought in Zach Ertz firmly became the number 2 target on this team. Even with DeAndre Hopkins, even last year with Marquise Brown on the team and everything going on, he was still the guy that Kyler Murray was looking to before his injury. So that could absolutely continue to carry forward with Trey McBride, and we saw it happen this week. The one thing that I would worry about with Trey McBride, once Murray gets a little bit more comfortable being back on the field, is if he doesn't start taking more deep shots and getting Marquise Brown worked back into the game a little bit more often as well, and some of those intermediate routes. Keep an eye on all of that. But in this matchup, going up against Houston, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points to the tight end position, I'll absolutely be allowing Trey McBride into my top, let's say 7 this week, with huge potential upside. 4 touchdowns in his last 6 games, at least 60 receiving yards in 5 of his last 6 games. And Dalton Schultz, after kind of a slow start to the season, is starting to get looks from CJ Stroud more and more often, which is really, really good news. And I hope it can continue. And I do have some worries. Even though Houston throws the football a lot, Nico Collins was missing this past week. Tank Dell has been beat up during this frame in which Dalton Schultz has been playing well. Noah Brown hasn't really broken out until these past couple of weeks. So if we were to get Dalton Schultz, Noah Brown, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell all on the field together at the same time, where does the targets lie? Who's going to get the highest percentage of looks? Does it hurt Dalton Schultz at all? And that's part of the reason why I've still got to list him in yellow here, even though he's looked really, really good. If for some reason Nico Collins misses again, he probably bumps up to a green, but it is still a tough matchup, so he's still going to bring some risk. Because as poor as Arizona's defense has been at times this season, stopping tight ends has still been one of the areas that they've excelled at. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So there's still going to be a whole lot to look at with this matchup throughout the week as we wait to hear a little bit more on Nico Collins. Make sure that you check back on the rankings. As of right now, Dalton Schultz is a start. He's a risky start, but he's a start. But he could gain a lot more safety as the week goes on. Any hope that we had for Chigioco has basically disappeared at this point. Because last week, Josh Weil and Trevon Wesco almost had nearly identical snap numbers as Chigioco. Whether it's because Tennessee has decided to start running 2 tight end sets, whether they're mixing guys in and out, more snaps for more tight ends does not bode well for Chigioco. And unfortunately, at this point, his value is shot for the season, and really any use of the tight end position is out the door for Tennessee. So instead, let's focus on Evan Engram, because I think once again, there's going to be a lot of questions about, are we starting him or not starting him this week? Engram was the only tight end to finish inside the top 12 each of the first 4 games of the 2023 season. Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce both did, but if you remember correctly, they both missed week 1. But since then, he's had 2 finishes outside the top 20, 2 more at number 14 and 1 at number 13. Unfortunately, at this point, Evan Engram is just not getting any upside. And the big reason is he's just not scoring touchdowns. Now, the struggles of Jacksonville's offense as a whole is a big part of that because he's not being utilized in the red zone. But really everywhere else, he's still getting a decent amount of looks. Evan Engram is actually 3rd in the league right now in targets. He's getting looked at plenty in this offense, which helps his floor, because if you take a look at the other tight ends around him, he actually may have one of the safest floors, because for the most part, we know he's probably going to finish inside the top 14 tight ends, just given the amount of targets he sees on a weekly basis. But he's not putting together high yardage gains. He's not putting together big plays, and he's not putting together touchdowns. So while his ceiling won't take him anywhere near top 5 status right now, if you're looking for a guy that you can play that's just going to get you a decent amount of points, in all but 2 games this season, Evan Engram's been inside the top 14, and more than likely that will continue, even if it does, with really no ceiling at all. Whew. If you're looking towards Las Vegas and Miami to put on a show for you at the tight end position, I would be ready to fall asleep, just like I was. And if you want to chase Michael Mayer and his touchdown last week, go ahead, because outside of that touchdown and 1 drive this season, he hasn't been looked at all. In this offense, it's already been made known. They're going to run the ball with Josh Jacobs, and they're going to throw the ball to Davante Adams. And yeah, maybe this week, if the game gets out of control for Las Vegas and Miami puts it on him, maybe he does see a few more targets, but he's like a super high risk start at this point. If you want to play Michael Mayer this week, you're going to have to hope that he gets into the end zone, because that's really where he's going to make his fantasy value. I probably do have him just inside the top 18, but once again, he's carrying a red risk because outside of, again, 1 touchdown and 1 drive, he's done absolutely nothing all season long. So just hope that Las Vegas lets this game get out of control super early and that Michael Mayer can just benefit from that. We all know that meme of like the 2 Spider-Mans pointing at each other, right? Like, hey, you're the same person as me. And we make jokes about other people with that. But I'm going to be super honest here. Like, that meme should be created, but with Evan Engram and Logan Thomas on it, because Logan Thomas is Evan Engram and a far less fancy offense with a far less fancier quarterback, and is doing exactly the same thing. Getting a lot of targets, not really putting together a whole ton of big plays, so he doesn't have a great ceiling every week, But the big difference between Logan Thomas and Evan Engram is that Logan Thomas has scored 3 touchdowns this season. So while the New York Giants may allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position, I do think we probably find ourselves in a situation where Washington comes out and throws the football, because that's exactly what they did against New York a couple of weeks ago. And it didn't work out nearly as good as they probably would have hoped for, but it just seems to be Washington's MO this year. We're going to come out and we're going to throw the football until we make mistakes, and then we'll throw the football a little bit more, but we'll try to run it a little bit at that point as well. So Logan Thomas this week, probably 4, 5, 6 targets, maybe 35, 40, 45 receiving yards. And if he doesn't score a touchdown, not that great of a week, probably inside the top 18 tight ends, but if he scores a touchdown, maybe inside the top 10. It's really a whole lot of maybes, and that's why he carries a fair amount of risk when you try to put him in your lineup. Because once again, we don't know when the ceiling is going to be there, and it's not going to be there. But on a weekly basis, if you're just looking for points, he hasn't really been that bad. Now, Cade Otton continues to play more snaps than any tight end in football. So as a fantasy analyst, I can look at that and say, that's great that he's on the field, but he's not getting any work. As a tight end connoisseur, as you would say about me, it drives me freaking nuts that Cade Otton plays more than any tight end in football and doesn't get looked at by Baker Mayfield. I get that he has Mike Evans. I get that he has Chris Godwin. I get that he's been throwing the ball to Rachaad White a lot more here in the second half of the season. But my gosh, if you're going to have your tight end on the field more than 90% of the time, can we please get him a few more targets? I think he deserves it. But until that happens on a consistent basis, we're not going to be able to roll with him or even consider it, especially in a matchup when you're facing the team that allows the 4th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. But for George Kittle, huge week last week. Now, it wasn't on very much volume, but he absolutely went off. And over the last 5 games, he's been a tight end 1 4 times, including 3 finishes inside the top 3. So we know the ceiling is there for George Kittle, and I don't think anybody has ever argued against George Kittle and his ceiling in this offense. The biggest issue with his risk and his consistency is you still have Brandon Ayuk, you still have Deebo Samuel, and you still have Christian McCaffrey. Now, this matchup going up against the Tampa Bay Bucks, they allow a ton of passing yards, second most in the NFL right now, and they absolutely shut down the run. So if Christian McCaffrey in the run game can't really get going this week, and Tampa Bay is able to at least keep the game close, there should be plenty of passing opportunities. And my hope is that George Kittle may get a little bit more volume than we saw last week, because it would really help his floor, and that's the reason he's a risk this week in yellow, is because his floor isn't as great as we would like, but his ceiling is awesome. And based on the other options we have at the tight end position right now, if you're chasing points in any given week, George Kittle is one of the best bets to try and chase down those points. What feels like weeks ago now at this point, when Aaron Rodgers went down with his injury and Zach Wilson became the starter and the Jets said, we're not trading for anybody, we're not making anyone else the starter, we're sticking with him, which they reiterated this week once again, I was like, Tyler Conklin's perfect. Let's take a look at Tyler Conklin and let's get Zach Wilson a guy that he can get the ball out quickly to, high percentage passes, high percentage completions, move the ball down the field, dink and dunk if we need to. Let's just put Zach Wilson in an area to succeed. And it didn't happen. And I was like, all right, well, I look stupid for trusting the Jets and Zach Wilson to do something right. But then now, all of a sudden, over the last couple of weeks, Tyler Conklin has 13 total targets, which is great because he's also up over 120 receiving yards over the last couple of weeks, which is great because we could use another safe option at the tight end position right now. And if Tyler Conklin can continue to hold down that type of a role in this offense, he absolutely could become a guy towards the end of the season that he might not win us any weeks, but if the dude can catch 5 or 6 balls for 60 yards and give us right around 10 fantasy points, we'll be happy with that. A majority of us anyway who don't have any other options at the tight end position. So he's still going to carry some risk for me because until I see it on a more consistent basis, I really can't fall in love with it. Now, this matchup for the Jets and Buffalo, Both teams' defense is right in the middle of the road against stopping the tight end position. So we do know that they're going to get after the quarterback, and Zach Wilson's probably going to need to get rid of the ball pretty quickly. So if you're looking for a decent option, you could look at Tyler Conklin this week. Just know that it could end up being 0 points or 1 point instead of 10 points. Now, Dalton Kincaid has been one of the best tight end options in football since Dawson Knox got hurt. And with a touchdown this past week on Monday Night Football, he continued that trend. And for everyone that jumped in on the Dalton Kincaid bandwagon early this season and stuck through it, hopefully you've been rewarded because you held on to him. Because prior to missing week 6, Dalton Kincaid had only finished inside the top 20 tight ends one time, and that was at number 17. But since then, he has finished as the tight end 7, tight end 7, tight end 11, and tight end 4. The New York Jets are really good against the pass on the outside. So the hope is that Dalton Kincaid playing from the inline position or in the slot can give us a little bit of value if Josh Allen is looking his way quite a bit this week. The change in offensive philosophy from Ken Dorsey, though, is going to be interesting and something that we will monitor in the coming weeks. But if one of your best players on your offense, one of your most consistent players over the last few weeks is playing as well as Dalton Kincaid it makes absolutely no sense to stop utilizing him. Okay, super serious moment. Come in. Come closer. Come closer. Too much. Back up just a little bit, okay? If you're looking at the Seattle-Los Angeles Rams matchup for your tight end to start this week, you've already lost your week. But in all seriousness, neither of these guys are worth utilizing in fantasy football right now. They haven't seen enough upside. They haven't seen enough usage. They haven't seen enough consistency. This, unfortunately, is just one of those matchups where the tight end position, there's really not a whole lot to say. Unfortunately, some of us were tricked last week when it came out on Sunday morning that TJ Hockenson would either be limited or would only be used in specific situations, so may not see a full workload, and then proceeded to go off and have his biggest game of the season, it feels like. And now he's going to be getting the Denver Broncos, who just allowed a touchdown to Dalton Kincaid and allow the most fantasy points to the tight end position. Now, I will say this about Denver. Kudos to their coaching staff for getting some things turned around on the defensive side of the football. The pass protection right now is 1,000 times better than what it was at the beginning of the year. But TJ Hockenson, once again, is going to be a guy that's going to be looked at quite a bit in this offense. And if anything comes out later in the week that says he could be limited or he's still banged up or whatever it may be, we'll just know to ignore it this time and continue to roll forward with him. At one point last week, I had him as my tight end 2. I did drop him to tight end 7 with that news. So hopefully, if you didn't have anybody ranked over him, you still played him anyway. But this week, I'm going to rank him high and we're going to leave him there. Well, unfortunately, with Dallas Goedert hurt, this is not going to be the tight end matchup that we once hoped for a couple of weeks ago. And the Philadelphia Eagles have brought in a couple of tight ends, and they're going to be shuffling some guys around. So right now, not really anybody to utilize at the tight end position. It's going to be a whole lot of A.J. Brown, a whole lot of Devontae Smith, and probably a little DeAndre Swift mixed in with it. So if you're looking to utilize anyone from Philadelphia, I wouldn't. I would look at maybe some other guys in this video first. But for Travis Kelce, he absolutely could have a huge bounce back week. Going up against an Eagles defense that has absolutely had tons of issues stopping not only the tight end position, but the pass in general, like a couple of weeks ago when they faced Jake Ferguson. So Travis Kelce, who's averaging 7 receptions a game, over 70 receiving yards a game, and 14 fantasy points per game, will absolutely be the tight end 1 this week. Well, there you have it, Headliner Nation. My breakdown for all 14 matchups this week and what it means for the tight end position. And if you're struggling at the tight end position, which I know a lot of people are right now, hopefully you were able to get something from this and find your starting tight end for this week if you don't have one of the top guys. Hit the like button for me on the way out. Make sure you turn on those bell notifications. Anytime we go live or drop content, you're going to want to know about it. And let me know down in the comments below who is your super duper secret tight end stash of the week. Make sure you whisper it so nobody can hear you. Headliner Nation, I'm going to get out of here. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.